I think we can start. Everything is set, and I'm very happy that the ambassador is welcoming us in the first place and having us. Thank you.
So, good afternoon. My name is Petter Ølberg. I'm the Norwegian ambassador here in Berlin. We are gathered, some of us at least, here in the Nordic Embassy compound. Dear Mr. Egeland, dear Ms. Fries-Gaier, dear Ms. Kalfan, dear Mr. Südhoff, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to welcome you all here this afternoon, whether you are with us here in the auditorium or joining us virtually. Just like Germany and the NRC, Norway is a signatory to the Grand Bargain. We have committed to getting more means into the hands of the people in need and to enhance humanitarian action. Through 2021, Norway will donate over 610 million euros to humanitarian purposes, a record high for Norway, the sixth largest donor in the world last year. These numbers matter, but they are not the ones that matter the most. What really matters is how many people we can help, the actual impact the help has, and how lasting our results are. That again depends on generous financial contributions, but also on how these contributions are utilized. Our main goals are to save lives, to ease suffering, and to protect people's dignity in conflict and crisis. To do that, Norway will continue to be a large donor, but we will also engage by pursuing innovations and coordinated efforts within the humanitarian field. We believe that the Grand Bargain is and can continue to be such an innovation. A multilateral and multi-sectoral approach is the only way to address complex crises. It is decisive that we work closely with organizations that are able to adapt and which are familiar with local conditions. The Grand Bargain does just that. It brings important stakeholders together and centers its work around the people it is committed to serve. Its inclusive character forms a powerful platform apt and able to drive positive change. It's therefore a pleasure for me to welcome Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council, an eminent person of the Grand Bargain, Jan Egeland. Should I call you His Eminence now, or is that personal? Is okay. To share his thoughts and ambitions for the future of the Grand Bargain. I also look forward to hearing a vivid discussion with some of the leading experts in the field. A special welcome then to Director for Humanitarian Assistance in the German Foreign Office, Susanne Fries-Gaier. And a special welcome to Hibak Kalfan from the Network for Empowered Aid Response, joining us from the United States. Thank you. I don't know if he's with us, but thank you for joining us so early in the morning, Ms. Kalfan. And I would now leave the floor to the Director of the Center for Humanitarian Action, Ralf Südhoff. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ambassador. Many thanks for having us. Many thanks for your intro. It's always a pleasure to be here in this great hall, and it's great to be with all you here who can be on site today. Good afternoon in Berlin. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are online. It's great that you join us to our event, and I'm really happy to welcome you for, I believe, really crucial debate on Grand Bargain 2.0 and new dynamics for humanitarian reform. My name is Ralf Südhoff. I'm the director of the Center for Humanitarian Action. And this crucial debate, we believe we need to discuss in further depth and much more even in future, comes from a reform, the much needed reform of an overstretched humanitarian system. We see this in latest conflicts in Afghanistan, which we will touch on today, in Tigray, but also by weather disasters quadrupling over the past decades, as we can see in the middle of Europe, by even floods in Germany and fires in Greece. Whoever has worked in the humanitarian system or for any organization, I believe, would agree we see at least a quadruple challenge for the humanitarian system today. One, we see booming humanitarian needs of a record number of people who don't know how to feed the children, who don't have safe water to drink, no doctor, or even keep struggling to survive day by day. We see an ever-growing gap of funding to support this record number of people, which mirrors today 3 times the population of Germany. We see a humanitarian world which is on the one hand a success story of saving hundreds of millions of lives every year under the most difficult circumstances, but at the same time one might admit, at least as a practitioner who worked for 12 years in the system, that there is a lot of waste of resources and inefficiencies, starting, for example, by competition, often overriding coordination. And we must say that by these financial millions lost, we lose also millions of other lives which could have been saved. These 3 challenges might also have a root in the challenge number 4, as we try to fix for decades the challenge that communities and the people our system is supposed to serve are not really sitting on the table, and they are not taking the decisions with us, while these decisions might for some of them be a question, or their communities a question of life and death. So we need a reform. So welcome you to talk about what some say is the most ambitious and most inclusive project for years to push much needed reform of the humanitarian system, the Grand Bargain, and by now the Grand Bargain 2.0 as agreed in June, so it's really brand new. While 5 years ago there has been a deal, just to recap for everybody who hasn't been engaged in all these debates in detail, there has been a deal between donor governments and aid agencies. This deal has been donors would provide trust in the sense of providing flexible funding, less bureaucracy, long-term funding, trust exchange with aid agencies who would use this new freedom and opportunities to deliver aid in an efficient, very accountable and very transparent way. Many have been tired on ever ongoing debates about humanitarian reform, but the Grand Bargain is different, as our keynote speaker noted, and we might take a quick look on Jan Egeland, what he stated 5 years on after the World Humanitarian Summit. There are so many multilateral and international processes that reach a dead end. This one has not. This view has been seconded by the independent review of the Grand Bargain after 5 years, which concluded the Grand Bargain has evolved into a key multilateral policy forum with demonstrable results, as our colleagues from the Humanitarian Policy Group reviewed. Others might see the Grand Bargain still as a club just talking and not really delivering. So what could be a joint starting point maybe for our discussion? Our own CHAR analysis and publication maybe came to a conclusion which could be of some help, we hope at least. Quoting, the Grand Bargain as we've seen it so far remained predominantly output-oriented and thus rarely achieved comprehensive outcomes. The Grand Bargain aims defined as process relevant, oftentimes materialized in interesting programs and pilot projects, but rarely in a change of processes themselves. And the Grand Bargain aims defined as system relevant, set important initiatives in motion, however fundamental questions concerning, for example, localization of aid and so-called participation revolution were not furthered in any decisive way. Mirroring this analysis, just to so we are all on the same page, what happened in June maybe have been the GB 2.0 meeting, which came to a couple of interesting decisions, which we can quickly share in the next slide. For a start, to continue and to prioritize the Grand Bargain as a 2.0 for 2 years, to implement and integrate now its result, to define strategic political priorities, and to push them in a new format to the political caucuses we will surely discuss today, and to create national reference groups on the local level to ensure there is monitoring if things are moving on. And all this is focusing on 2 future enabling priorities only, which we can see in a quick graph if we see the new structure of the Grand Bargain and jump onto the 3 bottom boxes, which are the crucial ones. The strategic objective of the Grand Bargain, which is pretty similar, one might say, to the one 5 years ago, but focusing on 2 enabling priorities only: quality funding and support to local responders. So if you think about in the light of these 2 objectives, if you think about top experts to look into these 2 priorities, I'm really happy for 2 of our panelists. For one, we have a top donor, the top 2 donor actually of the world with us, and in specific the person in the driver's seat now of this top donor, the just appointed new director for humanitarian assistance of the German Foreign Office. She's been so kind to come right after appointment to our event and her first public appearance, so please give a hand to Susanne Fries-Gaier. Second, if we could move to Washington quickly, if you think about a top expert and representative of a local NGO network, and the number 1 organization feeding into the Grand Bargain 2.0 in future, you will be as happy as us that today is joining us Hibak Kalfan, the executive director of the NIA network. She's with us from Washington, so please give a hand to Hibak Kalfan. However, first of all, let's look at the cross-cutting challenge to implement the often impressive results of the Grand Bargain and the technical work streams we've seen before into a new action format by a new GB 2.0. There has been agreement that, first of all, that an eminent person is needed. We talked about that already, about the new eminency, who has not only the expertise, but also the contacts and diverse experience to run this. So the choice has been Jan Egeland. We are very happy that you are today with us and you speak in public for the first time with us about your plans. Yes, please start now, giving a hand to Jan Egeland. Even if you only look at the highlights of this CV of Jan Egeland, you will realize that it would be hard to find somebody else who mirrors the diversity of the Grand Bargain signatories in the same way. Jan Egeland started his humanitarian life in a local NGO in Colombia. He brings government experience with him as former state minister. He has been with the Red Cross in Norway and Geneva, and he was appointed the UN Emergency Relief Coordinator in 2003, while he heads today NRC, one of the largest international NGOs, and our co-host of this event, who kindly asked us to join them. Last but not least, one might think that for global humanitarian reform, you need some superhero powers. So we are happy that at least 2 Norwegian comedians are sure you bring them with you, as you can see in a pretty famous song by now with 18 million viewers on YouTube. So be reassured, we have a special guest today. Jan, it's evident you have a good sense of humor, which is a good start for working in the humanitarian world. But even a real superhero might wonder, should I accept such a complex global task like the Grand Bargain and global humanitarian reform? Why did you accept this job?
Well, I think I said yes after some reflection, really, because I am not a very good person on lengthy processes and long meetings and seminars and panels, for that matter. I like action. But I did feel that the priorities of the Grand Bargain, this point in history for humanitarian work, there was an opportunity to move things forward. So for me, 5 years now of a lot of studies, a lot of discussions, etc. It's pretty clear what needs to be done. And this is what you also said in the introduction, Ralf. Too many people suffer alone. We're not there when they are in the hour of greatest need. Too little resources, but also we're not efficient enough. I think this can change now with quality funding and with local organizations being a true partner for the whole humanitarian effort. And by this participation revolution, they need to tell us how we're doing, they need to tell us what their needs are, and then they need to tell us how we can help them help themselves. So that's why I often said, you know, whether we succeed or not is not whether we have very many people being happy in our meetings, it is whether people are helped in the Kivus in Congo, or today in Kandahar in Afghanistan, 2 cases here. That's the test, the Kivu test, the Kandahar test, whether we actually make progress. I think we can do it.
To make progress, you've been straightforward saying, well, we need a political push. We need to talk about politics. We need to move political issues. In the Grand Bargain Review has been shared a quote framing that already in the way, it would be naive to believe that the kind of transformational change envisaged by the Grand Bargain can be motivated by a sense of shared humanity alone. These are political actors making political decisions. Political tactics are thus required. So what are your political tactics with all your experience?
Well, I was also, I don't know if you listed the things I've done. I mean, of course, I was also, as the ambassador may remember, the Deputy Foreign Minister of Norway, the State Secretary responsible for international assistance for 7 years, Norway being one of the top 10 donors. So I know that the decision makers need to be, we need to put in front of them very clear possibilities to make decisions. I mean, clear alternatives with strong arguments. And then we may have to make it pretty clear that it's now in your court. It's not in my court. It's now up to Germany, to the UK, to the US, to the EU to take 4 of the largest donors. You have something in front of you now. Do it. Take this decision. It is now possible to make further progress on quality funding so that humanitarian actors do not have to spend 3 months now with the new realities in Afghanistan, when, you know, children are going to starve to death and freeze to death this winter in Afghanistan, unless we have flexible quality funding for those organizations who do stay and deliver. So it's pretty clear it needs to come to the decision makers, but they need also have clear proposed decisions in front of them. And I think it's been too much of a seminar, you know. So you need to do something. No, you need to say that 10%, 15%, whatever needs to flow to local organization. You need to have always a participation element when you have a program, always. And there should be well over 50% of any assistance from any donor should be quality funding. And we also know what that is. Multi-year, flexible funding, so that the organization do not spend most of their time writing applications and reports, but they spend most of their times helping people and listening to people.
Issue before we elaborate on these really crucial questions of what does quality funding mean actually. The obstacle I think many face dealing with funding is there are very political reasons not to do what humanitarians ask for. I mean, take the example, earmarking humanitarian funds has often a political reason to rather spend it in migration contexts. Not providing multi-year funding is an advantage if you want to have a minister who, wherever he travels to, can announce some funding. And there are many political reasons why Norway and Germany, of course, never would do that, but it is a political issue, and it's very hard to overcome that, and to overcome it with only the humanitarian argument. Would you agree, and how can you fix that political interest might not run into your favor?
No, I mean, you're right, Ralf. There are actually a couple of donors who now have 90% of their humanitarian funding, so-called quality funding. Of course, those ministers cannot travel the world and announce new fantastic gifts when they travel to a place or they go to a donor conference, because the money is already tied up in pooled funds or in framework agreements with humanitarian actors, etc. So we need to give more credit to those donors who have not, who do not want to be Santa Claus all the time. They are quality donors, and then we need to, in a way, expose those who have 90% non-quality. I mean, it's all earmarked, or it's all short term, or it's all by application and so on. I think we also need to be honest in exposing those who are doing the good thing and those who are waiting. In some places, it's also tied to lengthy parliamentarian processes. Some countries have issues with their governance system, but it's not like any country cannot change the way they do it, even the budgeting processes and so on. I know there are issues also with the budgeting process here in Germany and the relation with the Bundestag and between the two ministries and all of those things. Of course, they can also be solved by elected politicians. We need to ask for that change. And then, and the argument is, these children in Kandahar, they need our help now, really. And the system we have is either too slow or too inefficient to really deliver to its full potential. That's the argument.
If we refer your hopes and your plans to the GB 2.0 and the new structure, this idea to have a political caucus to get these things moving, to make the grand bargain now implementing and strategic, how is that supposed to work? How can a political caucus help if you can't convince a finance minister to provide flexible funding?
Well, the new way of working is supposed to be indeed short-term, focused, explicit caucus with all those who really need to be there in the room to make decisions, or rather to make decisions about having a proposed decision. Instead of the work streams, as they were called in the past, which were more like a little bit of an endless seminar. You know, it just the stream. I mean, the stream flows forever until it reaches the ocean and disappears in the ocean. So a caucus, we said we would like to have a caucus on localization, and our friends in NEAR network would be part of that. And the NEAR network, we have invited into the board of the Grand Bargain, the facilitation group, because localization efforts are so important. So there will be one caucus on localization, but it would be focusing on intermediaries especially. So the role of those organizations who can take funding and be accountable of the funding, but get it to the local organizations with overhead for them, for example. So that's one of the caucuses. It's a pretty focused thing, really, and it should come up with a focused decision that could go to the political level. Same for quality funding. We will have a caucus on finding out how more donors can be like the best donors in having quality funding, and the final one is on cash coordination, which is cash is fantastic because we now have 20% doing cash. I remember 5 years ago people said, cannot use for cash, it is corrupt. These people are irresponsible, they shouldn't give them cash, and there will be corruption, and it will be we had a revolution, 20% now, so it's billions going as multi-purpose cash in the hand of people who can decide for themselves. But there's no coordination of it really, and it's inefficient. Special caucus on that.
And who's on the table in the caucus? You said all crucial people need to sit at one table, and how do you get them on the table? The
stakeholders, and that's what the good thing about the Grand Bargain is, as opposed to many of the other fora we have, where it's either we, the humanitarians, sitting in the room, the UN, the Red Cross, the NGOs, trying to agree, or it's the donors meeting in the good humanitarian donorship one and so on, or the local groups here and the international there. It's the only fora where the donors The UN, the Red Cross, Red Crescent, the international non-governmental organizations, and the local organizations sit together. So they should also be represented in the caucus, but not 1 million donors and a million humanitarians. A few, a representative one, say for cash coordination, we need a little group that can really, that do today disagree actually. They do today disagree, come up with a compromise solution.
Many thanks for this first round. If we touched already on localization issues, it's a good time to move on to our second panelist, Hibak Kalfan, who can hopefully hear and see us in Washington. Good morning, Hibak in Washington. You can hear us and you could listen, right? But we can't yet hear you, but probably you need to be unmuted only. In the meantime, I take the pleasure to introduce you quickly. Hibak Kalfan has worked for the UN as well and has been a country director with Internews Network in Somalia, but she's also been a senior program officer of Relief International and, what I didn't know, a service banker for a couple of years, and so you have really a financial background from the ground indeed as well. But today Hibak is the executive director of NEAR. And NEAR is best placed to discuss with us the future and the potential impact of GB 2.0, as indeed you've been selected to join the Grand Bargain Facilitation Group, which is a bit the core management group of the Grand Bargain, as most of you will know, but astonishingly didn't have a seat for any Global South representative in the past 5 years. Imagine. Looking at that, why is it worth continuing, even supporting now in future, a Grand Bargain 2.0 for NEAR and including your own very personal engagement? You still need to be unmuted. I hope that can be fixed. We can't hear you yet. I don't know about online. Online, but we can't hear her in Berlin.
Hello?
Can you continue speaking? They give me signs.
Sure.
No.
Does it work? No? I can see my big, there we go.
Excellent. So, but you could hear everything and you have been introduced and the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon. As Jan said, this is the only fora that includes the diverse stakeholders. And so for us, as NEAR, we have, our history is actually tied to the Grand Bargain process. We were launched at the World Humanitarian Summit. We've been very much involved in the localization work stream. And though, as Jan said, the action hasn't been maybe as fast as we had wanted, but the fact that the conversations were happening and previously didn't happen was really important. Local actors, I don't think, have been given or have received an opportunity similar to this in other fora. We're now starting to have conversations in the ISC, starting to have conversations in different fora. But this was, I think, the first formal fora that recognized local and national actors as a part of the humanitarian system. And so for us, there's an appreciation for that. And then now there's also this idea of quid pro quo is really important going forward. And so for us, we're committed as NEAR to be a part of this fora and hopefully many others.
We started talking a bit about political change is needed. What would that actually mean from your perspective? Who needs to change? Which action needs to be taken? Which actors do we need to address?
Do you have enough time? No. To be honest, I think that it's systems, right? It's at the beginning of the Grand Bargain. I think from both sides there wasn't a recognition of, once we made commitments, the 51 commitments, that systems were built to be able to enable those commitments. And I think it's more about the idea of, for instance, the 25%. Ensuring that there's tracking, ensuring that donor systems are in place to be able to fund local actors through one intermediary or directly, to think through some of these innovative solutions, to think through how we would be able to reach the communities, such as what Jan said, in Kandahar, in Kivu, in Haiti, as quick as possible. And for us, our continued argument is local actors and local civil society are there before, during, and after, and typically response without international funding from the very beginning. And so how do we ensure that support exists, and it exists on a continued basis, and we start speaking about systems that are in place to be able to move that forward?
And how could the GB 2.0 help in this? I mean, these have been debates for years, if not at times decades. Well, what's your hope? How can the GB 2.0 now make a difference, have a new format? What are your hopes? What do you expect from Jan?
Yeah, so, interestingly enough, with Jan's background, I think he has influence on a multitude of stakeholders. And the idea of this additional seat within the facilitation group, I think, means decision makers within the Grand Bargain will be diverse based on the stakeholders. I'm hoping to see a larger group of local signatories or Global South signatories. Now there's 3 amongst 64. That's something that we would like to see. We would like to see within the Caucasus actually short-term and medium-term goals, not just indicators that are really difficult to be able to meet within the time frame. We would also like to see within the national reference groups voices of the affected communities involved. We'd like to be able to see that there is a linkage between the global and the national conversations, and so that the Grand Bargain isn't just held at the global level, but it's something that's permeated within the system at the local level.
You mentioned already the national reference groups as a more local national layer. What are your hopes can be achieved by these groups, and how shall they feed into a future facilitation group discussion, GB discussion, and the overall progress?
So the facilitation group, and Jan specifically, has asked NIR and OCHA to work on what the framing of the national reference groups would look like. We're having live discussions currently with groups like Charter for Change, which includes international and local organizations, and many others. And the idea really is to be able to see that those national reference groups that tie into not only the Grand Bargain at the global level, but also the HCTs, where the decisions are also made. And being able to open it up to look at right now the diverse silo conversations, whether it's with a national network, a mixed network, or a global network, on the ground, and being able to make sure that the multi-stakeholders that exist within the Grand Bargain are able to converse and actually make decisions and move forward on their decisions. So that's kind of what we're excited about, is where the silos exist right now, us being able to hopefully bring those groups together to start making decisions together.
And 2 years is not that much time. Would you have in mind like 2 or 3 very concrete decisions you would like to see taken in the framework of the Grand Bargain so they can really deliver?
Well, I hope that it's longer than 2 years to start off with. But the Grand Bargain 2.0, I think one of the largest things for us, at least this NIR, has been this 25% commitment. We've seen that with COVID, it's unfortunately gone down. We saw from 2018 to 2019, it went from almost 4% to a little bit above 2% that local actors are getting through one intermediary. So we would like to see, I think, a greater commitment to that 25%. We would like to see systems in place. NIR and others are working on innovative solutions around financing. And so how we can work as a collective to be able to make sure those resources get, and that we increase that figure. Another thing for us is I'm not sure if it's going to happen in 2 years, but we've seen this shift from this idea of capacity building to capacity sharing. I think it's recognizing the capacity that exists within the Global South and kind of starting to develop this idea of how we can work together collectively. And I think the national reference groups might be a great point where we might be able to start that discussion and start to see tangible actions.
You mentioned the quantity of funding to local actors. Is there a concern that the debate about quality of funding now might push away the question of quantity of funding going to local actors?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, as Nina, when we were asked about the Grand Bargain 2.0, one of the things that we said was our red line was at 25% in continuing to be a part of the Grand Bargain. We think that though we understand that systems may not be in place to be able to track it or to be able to actually quantify or to be able to grant local actors that 25%, we still think that that goal should still exist. And so for us, it's very much a conversation around quantity and quality. And not moving forward as that discussion moves forward.
And final question, if you refer that to your partners, to intermediary organizations, what are your expectations, how their role shall play out within the Grand Bargain Forum and of course then in practice as well?
So we envision intermediaries as two. We envision intermediaries as international intermediaries, but also nationally led intermediaries. And I think we've seen more recently the presence of these larger, medium-sized local organizations that are able to absorb a large amount of money and have capacity. And so I think it's very important to consider these actors as actors that really could help with access issues in places where we identify that it's really difficult. And some of the lessons that have been learned in COVID with access as well, I think it's really important to consider national-led intermediaries. As far as international intermediaries, I think a lot of international agencies are now considering their role. I think with the cut of financing in 2019, 2020, that they've started to realize what their role could be and what their comparative advantage, I might say, could be. And so that conversation, I think, is a very interesting conversation that's evolved over the last year and a half.
Many thanks, Hibak. In another conversation, you mentioned already the idea of this national-led pooled funds, which could be an interesting tool also for donors like Germany, maybe, but we can discuss that right now, and we come back to you very soon, Hibak. Many thanks. With our next guest, Susanne Fries-Gaier. You bring broad humanitarian experience with you. You've been based York and dealing with humanitarian issues and the UN. You have been the humanitarian advisor until a few weeks ago of Chancellor Merkel, if I may put it that way, in the Chancellery, the key advisor on humanitarian politics, which have been at the heart of Merkel for many years, as most of you will know. You are the new director for humanitarian assistance of the German Foreign Office. If we take a realistic view, and Germans are pretty realistic usually, I guess, and down to earth, what would be a key achievement after 2 years if you are pragmatic but visionary at the same time?
Yeah. So before I answer this question, let me just take a quick step back. Because as you said, we Germans tend to be very pragmatic, realistic, but sometimes we look at things that have not worked. So which is not bad, because striving for perfection is always a good thing. But I guess that with the Great Bargain, we have really also reason to be proud of what we have achieved. Because if we look back at the baseline 5 years ago, we've come a long way. And I would like to mention 3 points. So first of all, and it was mentioned before by Jan and Hibak as well, the Grand Bargain is a unique platform for collaboration. So it brings together all the actors on a relatively level playing field. And so this is one of the major factors for the progress achieved so far. And if I look at Germany, for example, it really pushed us. So for example, we have now more multi-year funding. We fund more regional funds. We have more flexible funding. And we set up together with others these harmonized reporting template. It sounds a little bit technical, but I think it's quite relevant because it lessens the burden on the actors in the field. And this is progress. However, I agree, we have no reason to sit back, because if we look at the figures, 5 years, before 5 years and look at to now, I think it doubled, the needs doubled. So, and if we then keep in mind that with the COVID pandemic, there we have a real stress on all our budgets, So we really have to look at ways how we can be more efficient and effective. And so I would say we should take a pragmatic but also optimistic view. And now I come to your question, what I would like to see after hopefully the 2.0 action works. So first of all, I think that it's good that we focus on two already agreed on key issues, which is the quality funding and the localization. But on the other hand, we should keep in mind as well mainstreaming issues, like for example, gender. This would be very important for us. And now the trick is to set up a structure that is smart and flexible, but has still the capacity to push us all and to bring the process forward, which is not easy, but I trust that you will be able to do this. And at the same time, we shouldn't forget the other work streams. Because if you take, for example, Germany, I mentioned this working template. Now, many actors use it, so OCHA, UNHCR, all the big actors and many members, but not all of them. And it can only be really efficient if as many as possible use it. So of course, we will try to push it. So this is one thing which I would like to see at the end, that also this then is achieved. But what I would also like to see, and this is not a dedicated work stream, but it's the issue of anticipatory action. So why anticipatory action? So 6 years ago, I think we started with 8 projects, forecast-based financing. And now we have over 100 projects in over 60 countries that use this forecast-based measuring. So it works. But still, there is so much more to it. Because if you look at the figure, so the statistics say you can 20% of all humanitarian crises you can predict. And it's just 1% of all the humanitarian funding that is really dedicated to anticipatory action. So there is really something that we can do about it. And we will have an event together with OCHA and Great Britain on the 9th of September in New York to really try and convince others to look at it and to scale it up. So these are, together with the 2 focal points, other issues that I would like to see at the end of this process.
We hope we can share your optimism that this is working out. Maybe to touch base quickly on Germany's role in the grand bargain, we can appreciate quickly by looking at the graphic how multi-year funding has exploded over the past years, which is really a change everybody needs to give credit to, I believe. On the other hand, when we always love to look at humanitarian policies from Berlin, as you know, we concluded in our analysis that there have been, in the next slide, a couple of initiatives really helpful: multi-year funding, simpler reporting procedures, anticipatory humanitarian action. But unfortunately, key initiatives also on the German side didn't continue beyond the pilot phase if you want to scale them internationally. For example, anticipatory action, for example, harmonizing reporting procedures. So coming back to GP 2.0, how can that help to fix this? How can it help that to move these things?
So let me take the multi-year funding, for example. As you said, we are now at 64%, which is, I think, quite good. And we use more flexible funding, so unearmarked, softly earmarked, which is for us honestly not so easy because there is a very legal and administrative restraints to this. So, but we achieved 37%, and the Great Bargain says 30%. So I think we were quite well on track. But on the other hand, we have also to keep in mind that we need reporting. I know it's a burden again for those in the field, but we have to be able to tell our taxpayers about the whereabouts and the allocation of the funding. So this is then the trick. So we can and we will try to increase this, but still we have some problems with this, not meaning that we will not try to find ways to surround it.
But the GB 2.0 focus a format as a forum for you to push, for example, structural issues like anticipatory action. Can that help? I mean, or is it rather an internal domestic policy thing for you to move things in Germany?
I don't think so. So if we only move it, so it's good, but it's not good enough. So if we speak of scaling up, all the international organization and the membership has to be willing to do it. And that means, of course, if you look at anticipatory action, you might lose money. Because of course, if you, for example, before a flood, you have the warning and people move away and then it's perfect, but sometimes maybe the flood doesn't come and people moved away as well. But still, that's not a bad thing. And in the end, we will have not only saved money, but we have saved lives. And this is something, so it sounds so easy, but I know that it's difficult to really put a sum to this, but that's where we will lobby for. And of course, as I said at the beginning, the Grand Bargain, this is the forum where you can discuss ideas and also innovative solutions. So that's another field where Germany has a lot of interest in finding maybe new technical solutions. So absolutely, I think that's a good place to discuss this.
Maybe touching quickly on the other priority, the support to local responders of humanitarian action. Germany has substantially increased its funding to pooled funds. At the same time, it has been pretty clear that it can't fund directly local partners on any substantial scale, also not in the foreseeable future. So what's your approach? How do you want to get these things moving, and how can the GB 2.0 help you in this?
Yeah, as Hibak already said, so local actors are so important. They are there, they know the surrounding, they know the needs, they are there and quick and flexible. So of course we would like to really fund them, but I will come to this later, it's a little bit complicated for us. But I think there's more to it. So of course there is access to quality funding, but there is, and Hibak mentioned this as well, capacity building and partnerships. And I think on the part of capacity building, Germany delivered quite well, because now 1/3 of all our projects have a dedicated sum for capacity building. So this as such is very good, and we try whenever possible to work closely with local actors, and we have this project, it's called Together, in 8 different countries, and I think it's a very good example how it can work. But then again, and I have to be quite frank here, we will never manage to fund all the actors directly at a local level, because for us, because of legal restraints, that's just not possible. But now, and it's just for them too much work to get to fulfill the necessary requirements. So we have to find ways to circumvent this. And now, and Hibak mentioned it as well, we try to work with intermediaries and try that they can sort of hand over the costs so that it really reaches local actors, which is not always easy, but it has improved. And we would like to see this cascading effect, so the trickle down, that this works even better. And there is, I really hope for the Grand Bargain 2.0 that this will also be conducive to best practice example sharing and whatever can help to see how we can do this.
Many thanks. Maybe before, in a minute, Hibak, I would like to come back to you, how you view this future approach, for example, for a top donor like Germany, and the focus on intermediaries. Maybe quickly only, there have been, coming out of the Grand Bargain, has been a couple of proposals how donors could provide financial incentives to intermediaries to really share admin costs, to really share, do capacity sharing, and to make sure that quality funding provided is really transferred. Could Germany do more in this regard? Because like financial incentives or making it even a precondition for funding organizations is not really into play so far, one might say, which could be a fair summary.
Yeah, well, but we work together with the intermediate organizations, and I try to convince them that they give more money, and I think that it works. And at least in some instances we have, so they passed on not only the multi-year funds but as well the funds for indirect support, which is a very good thing. And so I think that's a way which we should continue.
There has been a move for everybody who isn't aware yet that Germany indeed is providing 2% of additional administrative funding in future to forward this to local agencies and local partnerships. Jan, you look like you would like to jump in for a minute. Hibak, if you don't mind, maybe we give the floor 1 minute to Jan, and then it's your turn again.
To make it lively, Ralf. It's very good to hear you, Susanne, and also Hibak. I'm so happy to be that we're on the same panel. Germany as a leader within the humanitarian sector cannot be underestimated, and the next 5 years will be looking to you. Really, I mean, you have had a phenomenal increase of funding. Many others have leveled off. Some have struggled and gone down, unfortunately. You provide more funding. 5 years ago, frankly, coming to Berlin, there wasn't that much of new ideas and big initiatives and so on. Now, it's really good. So, number one, bravo, Germany. You need to continue, and we need to hear you, and you need to play a leadership role. Then on how do we get funding to the local organization? 25% of the funding should really be through local groups, by, of, and for the people, as Lincoln would have said. And it's not going to happen with the present phase. How can it happen? Well, number one, the donors need to have it as requirements for the intermediaries. So, UN agencies that you are giving enormous sums, multi-year and quality, and I mean, there should be more of a requirement that more money should be able to reach these groups with overhead. And there is one agency that has started to do that. So the donors has to be a requirement, and there is too much competition within the humanitarian field that it's difficult actually for many of the humanitarians to by themselves drive this. The second element I think is important, again a little bit back to the donors, the compliance regimes and the zero tolerance against everything and anything it has become excessive in my view. So for a local group in Somalia or in Kandahar really to answer questions, how does your internal audit look like? Do you have people dedicated to on protection of sexual exploitation and abuse? Do you have training seminars? What is your child protection policy? Could we have it, please? And could we read it? What are your internal controllers system? How do you, I mean, and now you're going to have the echo audit, which is worse than going to the dentist. I mean, it's really excessive. So also for the intermediaries to be there, they also have to, in a way, not then be exposed for a risk where they are then having to pay back all the money that already was spent by somebody who could not have all of the receipts on all of the competitive bidding for all of the contracts, for example.
I agree that it should be risk sharing, but compliance is also a very important issue, right? So it's tricky to find a balance.
We will touch on that later, because then it's moving very fast to a political issue, because of course I think everybody will agree with everything Jan said. But where's the political momentum to change this and to overcome budget regulations, financial regulations, compliance issues, and to lobby for, well, don't deal with humanitarian aid in bombing in Syria crisis the same way as with some company building a kindergarten in Berlin. Hibak, if you hear the debate here, there's a lot of talk about intermediaries, how cascading of funding, etc. What's your feedback?
First, thanks, Jan, for saying what I wanted to say, which was I agree. It should be a requirement. I think donors have the political power, and ultimately, as the donors have the power to be able to say that it's a requirement for intermediaries to give funding to local actors. But I also wanted to bring up this other point. In the localization work stream, they did a study on pooled funding. And one thing that we contributed to, which has been really important to us, is what we call a hidden ecosystem, where intermediaries already exist. From a community foundation perspective to a national pooled fund perspective, they exist, and they work within the development and peace building sectors. And so I think these are mechanisms that could work. Thinking through compliance. Compliance as an issue is something that of course is important because these are taxpayer dollars, but they have the systems in place to be able to support local organizations to absorb this funding, to be able to get the receipts, to be able to work through systems. I agree. There are some donors that it's nearly impossible, and there is a zero tolerance. I don't think there should be a zero tolerance. There isn't one agency or that I think are 100% have not had an issue. So it's really looking into the diversity of opportunities, not just international agencies or UN country-based pool funds, which I think work very well in some countries and I think can be better in others. But the idea for us really, and what we've done a lot of studies, and now we're in the process of actually operationalizing a fund in Somalia, is really thinking through what these nationally led pooled funds look like and supporting them because of the capacity or the lack of capacity that exists within donors to be able to administer so many grants. And so for us, we've spent the last couple of years really thinking through the barriers and challenges that exist at every step of the system and how we could actually address that as local actors.
As we discussed today, the Grand Bargain 2.0 and how it can help in these endeavors, what would be your ask? What should happen within the framework of GB 2.0? For example, there has been talk that one of the political caucuses should focus on this country-based funding. Is that something you would like to ask for, or how do we make sure that the new format is really helping in what you are asking for?
Well, I think that the changes are going to be effective at the national reference groups. I think even if we have these political caucuses and we make these commitments like we made in 2016, they may not reach the ground unless we have actionable institutions on the ground being able to move it forward. We've seen this disconnect between international agencies at the country level and at the headquarter level. And so what I would like to see is to be able to have that connection between the country level and the global level. I think that's extremely important. And I think it's also really important to recognize localization isn't just about the 25%. It's about local leadership. It's about improved partnerships. It's about, improved capacity on both ends and capacity sharing. And so when we're talking about localization as an enabling priority in the Grand Bargain 2.0, I think it's really important to open that up and be able to talk about tangible changes over the next 2 years and hopefully further.
Maybe quickly jumping and indeed moving on from the financial challenges to the question of partnerships and cultures of partnerships. We can share a survey which has been done by Michael Barnett, Smruti Patel, and published only a few days ago on the question, why do organizations move into partnerships, and what has been the key motivation? And the Grand Bargain, of course, and all its work streams worked out, well, it is about learning from each other, it is about making humanitarian aid better. If you look at the respondents, two sides of respondents, there have been aid workers asked in the Global South and in the Global North. What's their perception? Why, on the first question, do international aid agencies pursue local partnerships? It's pretty obvious that it's the highest ranking is mainly it's for their own organizational reasons, while the common goods like improving effectiveness of aid or increasing opportunities for learning are lowest ranked. Now that might play into the perception of some at least from some Global South actors. If you move to the second question, so what about local actors? Why do they move into partnerships with international partners? If we can look at the second slide, it's exactly the same. So if I might play that back to you, Hibak, is there also a change of culture needed for capacity sharing, as you framed it, for learning from each other, for looking for the best division of labor in all these operations from a local side?
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the way the grand bargain was in 2016, I think the number one conversation about partnerships was this idea of sub-granting or contracting. And I think that that's shifted. I think there's more of a conversation around strategic partnerships now. I mean, we're working with a lot of international agencies of not only how to define that, but working through the project life cycle. So thinking about it from the beginning of a proposal period or a framework period all the way to an M&E period or an evaluation period of the project. And I think thinking through it as a strategic partnership, you might see some of these numbers grow. That's where I think you're able to determine that risks aren't just shifted from one side to the other, but shared. That's when you start to think through learning and being able to learn from both sides. And of course, there are going to be places where access is always an issue, but I think that we need to go beyond that and think about what's each group's value and what's their comparative advantage. Like I said before, what does the international provide and what does the local provide? And ultimately that we all continue to think and realize that we're all doing this for the affected community, for that person in Somalia or Kandahar or Kivu. And so when we analyze it from that perspective, I think, and think through it as a strategic partnership, some of these numbers will tend to shift.
Maybe quickly coming back to the issue, or to the new idea of the national reference groups, maybe asking Hibak, you in the first place, can they also help in future in dealing with such issues, with overcoming different approaches of cultural ways to see how partnerships should evolve, to understand better what are the priorities of the other actors, to really to get a joint approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the national reference groups are going to be that place where we've been talking about accountability. It's that perfect place to be able to hold all the different stakeholders to account and to be able to start to have these very important conversations. You know, you've seen it with Akbar in Afghanistan, you've seen it with the Somalia NGO Consortium in Somalia, where they start to pair groups together and they start to learn and they start to shift to this strategic partnership. So the solution exists, and I think that the national reference groups is a great place for that to be able to happen.
That's just another layer and another gremium. How does it link to what is discussed already on the national level, on the international level? You are confident that especially local actors have the staff and the capacity to engage and to bring in your views?
Sorry, that beginning of that question got cut off.
Some fear that that might be just another layer and it doesn't really have any impact if it's not really run, for example, by locals who have the staff, who have the capacity to engage and the finance to do so. You are confident that this is doable for example, your members?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's this assumption, there's this paint or a brush that's made for local actors. You know, we're not homogeneous. Just like there are small, medium-sized, and large-sized international NGOs, the same makeup exists for local and national actors. And so the capacity does exist in the countries. It's just recognizing, working with national networks and actually recognizing the actors that do have the access, the knowledge, and the capacity. And I think that that's another thing, that once we're able to really explain what the national reference groups are and what we're trying to achieve, I think we'll start to attract a lot of those organizations that are interested in being a part of this conversation.
Thank you. Jan, maybe quickly touching on this idea of national reference groups. What's your plan? What's the plan of your team?
I'm all for it, but it has to be wished by the local actors, really. I mean, or rather, all of the actors in the country, whether the Central African Republic that somehow wanted to start this, or it would be Syria, whatever, where there are very large operations, small operations, and so on. The little fear I have is that, well, we have now country directors, for example, for NRC, running from one coordination meeting to the other all week, basically. I mean, that's not good for the women of Kivu, that she should go there to help and do operations there and so on. So not another discussion forum. It should be, in my view, I hope you agree, Hibak, a kind of a clearinghouse for projects, for ways of working. Can we partner? Can we go together here? Can we split work? Is there something we can teach you and you teach us, and so on? I mean, clearly the local groups would be much better in community engagement, dialogue, etc. We could be much better in scaling up big operations, which they may never have done. I mean, World Food Programme can scale up like no other body on earth. When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, UN sent people to the US because they were unable to cope, basically. So there are things that no local groups, no local authorities can do that we can do from the international scene. And then there are many, many things we're not even close to being as effective and efficient on them in the long term, including, for example, livelihoods, which would be the next stage after emergency relief.
But you would agree that your NRC colleagues running from one coordination group to another, that there's the issue that rarely the local representatives are sitting on the table of these groups?
Well, in more and more, they are actually with the local humanitarian, the humanitarian country team is often replicated locally, and there is usually some, too few, but some local actors. And they also complain, listen, I'm in meetings all day. So we also have to be, again and again and again, very focused on, here are people who are not helping. How do we get to them? Who should do it? In what way? Which donors should we approach? How can we get their money fast? How can they be flexible? How can we then have a transition program, for example, from the international to the local actor? How can we empower them to take over? How can we exit? Very concrete things, in my view.
Hibak, any comments quickly on that one? Yes, please, come in.
Yeah, no, just to say that I think the national reference groups are going to be contextual, right? Every country is not going to be the same. But I agreed. I don't think it should be a whole other layer. But I think it should be a conversation of what that looks like in the different countries. I think the conversation we're having now are what are the few things that are most important that to be consistent within each group. But depending on which country and depending on what kind of mechanisms exist, I think that the national reference group could be layered into another group, or it could be something that's independent. So I think what's going to be most interesting about this is this contextualization conversation that we've been having for years. We'll be able to see what it actually looks like through this national reference group mechanism.
Agreed.
So we have some agreement, which is a good start. Maybe before we come to the chat and ask my colleague Darina to bring in what has been going on in the chat and comments and questions. And in the follow-up, please feel free here in the hall to raise questions. We have a mic which can be shared by our colleague at your seat, or if you feel more comfortable and you sit appropriately, you can also walk up here and use this mic. But 1 minute, maybe coming back quickly onto this macro question of political leverage. Germany has been praised for good reasons for its great financial engagement, while on the policy side it's still considered sometimes rather weak. Jan described it a few minutes ago that 5 years ago there was no idea in Berlin. Now we have, I think, some ideas here to offer. Well, sorry to rephrase you. Maybe quickly sharing something some of you might know already as the favorite chart graph. We keep lobbying that the financial engagement needs to get along with greater policy capacities, even in the capital, even in Berlin. And there has been some analysis. We can show a table on the staffing, for example, in the German Foreign Office, which tells you something about the leverage. But I think the colleagues from the technique have to get us back on the screen so we can move again slides. Thanks a lot. The proportion of, if you look at the right column, we keep updating this and it's really interesting, the proportion of how much funding a staff member in the German Foreign Office needs to deal with per capita on the right-hand side. If you compare it to Sweden, for example, or through some other top donors, is extremely different to other ones. At the same time, there is not much movement. I mean, you have restructured now the Foreign Office, there is some admin capacity, but it's not really a shift and change. And one might wonder if the political leadership of your house doesn't have this priority. You couldn't agree on that one, but I put it on the table.
Okay, so first of all, I just want to mention the figures just to see how we increased our funding, because it's really interesting. If you look at 2012, we dedicated 270 million to humanitarian assistance. Now it's 2.3 billion. So it's a huge increase. And as you said, it was not just the increase, a financial increase. We restructured the whole system, so to speak, because in 2016, we created a whole new department. So for humanitarian assistance, stabilization, with the idea to really work in a preventive way, so more than just in a reactive way. So it was really, there was a substantial layer to it. And the humanitarian assistance is really an integral part of our foreign office and policy. And the minister and the whole staff is really behind it. This slide is for us as well quite interesting, because we can always show it to the parliament and say, see, like others do it. But you have to see where we came from, and now we have a whole department. Of course they say, well, we dedicated a lot of staff to you. It's still not enough to, and we lobby for more, that's for sure. But I can assure you that there is more to it than just the increase of the funding. And we have now really a strategic look at it. As you said, we have a written strategy, and we have set out priorities. Some of them I already mentioned, anticipatory action, but as well, for example, protection of humanitarian workers. And when we were in the Security Council, this was as well one of our strong initiatives, the call to action. And so I think it has really changed, and there is political leverage behind it.
Fair enough. The number of employees hasn't increased that much for a couple of years, and I'm not complaining to you about it, as you know. Darina, if you would be ready to share some comments and questions from the chat, we would be really curious what's going on out there.
Yes, thank you very much. The chat has been very lively and very informed participants around here. So I clustered the chat questions in more or less 4 areas. One is related to process, and in that cluster, Smutri Patel from A4EP says that, of course, the grand bargain debate is now focusing very much on funding, but not so much anymore on shrinking the high needs that we've been talking about in the beginning of this discussion. So she is asking especially Jan Egeland, how can we make sure that we also focus on durable solutions and not so much only on the technical process? With regards to the process, she says that she is very much enjoying that A4EP and Syria Relief and NIR are also sharing the seat in the Grand Bargain Facilitation Group, but she also would like to see more local leaders from the Global South at that table, of course. And with regards to that, Howard Mollett addresses Susanne Fries-Gaier with regards to the national reference groups, because these are also depending on funding, of course, from donors. So he's asking about the plans of the German Foreign Affairs Ministry. So let's move to the second cluster, which is about linking advocacy and response of humanitarian action, and also it's a little bit much about the humanitarian development peace nexus. Sudhanshu Singh asks Jan Egeland, should we really keep the humanitarian response decoupled from the humanitarian advocacy, despite in some areas that doesn't seem to help in shrinking needs? He refers to Afghanistan for that. And the third cluster is on funding, which is always a debatable area. It's on quality funding and how that can be ensured in areas where political interests of the countries and also other relevant actors on site are, hampering a very principled humanitarian response. And last but not least, it's on the different actors, especially the role of donors and intermediaries. Here another question from Abraham McQuay from SINA to Susanne Fries-Gaier. He says that it's clearly understood that several international organizations that are funded by the German government are, instead of collaborating with local organizations, implementing themselves. So is there any policy of the German Foreign Affairs Office with that regard to support a more collaborative approach? And with regards to intermediaries, there has been lots of discussions, and the capacity strengthening is much appreciated, and also, the capacity of donors and intermediaries should be looked into, as we tried in the end of this discussion. And with that regard, Win Tu King from Caritas Myanmar is posing the last question. He says, how can we address that international leaders at the global level have a strong commitment to the grand bargain and localization, and who lead the international organizations at the national level? Because there is not always consistency, and that's also what others said in the chat. Sometimes there is not always consistency in the policy commitment at different levels and different actors. That's all from the chat, and I hope you have food for thoughts and more discussions.
That's of course easy to answer all of that. As we have already 4 major topics on the table, may I ask, it's pretty likely if anybody from your side would like to share a comment or a question that would touch on a similar one or a linked one to these, so it might make sense to link it if there is one, and we could start over here. Maybe if you just wait for the mic coming down the stairs, and then we can add it.
Many thanks. I'm Michael. I work for Diakonie Katastrophenhilfe in Brussels with the EU institutions. And I think we also need a very good internal discussion within the NGOs, not only in Germany but elsewhere. Because as some of the people in the chat, but also here on the panel, and also the colleague from NIR said, some of them are heavy self-implementers. And certainly, when it comes to localization, there's, there are frictions, strong frictions. And one idea might be to get the NRC people on the local board, or whatever you call that level, no? But there are certainly other models as well. So let's have this discussion. What does localization really mean? Funding-wise, organization-wise, what are the structures we need on the ground? And where do some of our self-implementing NGOs really need to change?
Thank you. There has been one more question here in the 4th row. If Leonie, if you can reach that with this magic stick. I'm not sure. Oh yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Alfredo Langa from the Institute on Studies on Humanitarian Action from Spain. So my question is very clear. It's about the human rights-based approach. So if there is any kind of idea in this grand bargain to introduce this human rights approach in the new reform. Okay.
Okay. And the final one at the top.
Thank you. My name is Marie Wagner. I work for the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin, and we heard a lot about anticipatory humanitarian action from you, Ms. Fries-Gaier, and I wanted to know maybe if we could have a reaction from more local actors or from the NEAR network on what you think about if that's actually feasible.
Okay, and then when I said final words, 2 more hands raised. So the neighbor of Marie.
Thanks a lot. Malte Sebens from the Center for International Peace Operations. I would like to ask where exactly is the space or the room for the triple nexus in the Grand Bargain 2.0? I understand that there is much criticism about that concept, And I would like to ask you where you see the future of that concept.
And Leonie, can you reach Caillou as well? Or move it over? My apologies to the online audience. I think you can't see the speakers in the room, but I hope you can hear them. And Hibak, you can hear them, which is most importantly.
Right, okay. I have a question to Hibak, actually. So my question would be, do you think that NEAR in itself is representative enough to actually give us a good picture of all these different NGOs, like local actors that are on the ground? For example, like I'm pretty much concerned with Syria operations, and I know that only very few of our Syria implementing partners are actually able to send somebody, actually somebody who has the time to work on advocacy and policy and whatever, you name it, all the time that you need to actually go to places and actually make your voice heard. I think besides me being completely pro-localization and Grand Bargain 2.0, there are some risks that rarely people talk about, and which is the point of localization probably not being diverse enough, because all the money, if localized money is going to the ground and the local NGOs, is going to a very small number of big local actors who actually have the capacities to make themselves heard. So that's my question, how we want to solve that. Right?
Thank you. Now I think we move it back to our panelists, so you have a chance to answer for a start. If I try to structure it a bit, maybe we start with the more practical questions in the beginning before we come back to the big politics and all the big questions. Susanne Fries-Gaier, if I can start with you, one of the questions has been on the national reference groups and the way to better support more collaborative approaches on the national, on the local level. Has there been something you've heard today which might inspire future German policies?
Absolutely. So as I said before, so we try within our legal constraints to find ways to help with capacity building and partnerships. And we already had some good example where it can work, and I'm open to other ideas. And I'm interested in to see how the setup of the new caucuses and so on will be, and if within this framework we can find some ways to build up partnerships as well. So definitely. So I think, we should look into it.
All right, so today at least we learned something from each other, which is a good start. Hibak, if I can move it on to you, and of course you can pick any question, but of course there's also been a very specific one on NEAR and the challenge to represent the global south, which is of course nonsense in itself.
Yeah, so we work with, can you guys hear me? Yes, okay.
Yes,
we work with networks, and so we have direct members, and we work with national networks across 43 countries. Of course, there is no way for NEAR to represent the entire global south, but what we believe in inclusivity, and that's one of the asks that we made in the Grand Bargain, to increase the number of signatories that are from the global south, whether it's through regional networks or national networks. As far as the concern around the idea of funding of I think hyperlocal organizations or smaller organizations, I think that's why it's really, really important to have this discussion around nationally led intermediaries and this idea of diversification of pooled funds, because I think that there have been some examples with community foundations where they've been able to work with these CBOs and CSOs, the smaller ones that work at the village level, who are not interested in working at the national level. And that allows for, I think, the ability to be able to support a diverse number of CSOs.
And maybe to pick one question to make sure you comment also on other issues. For example, the issue of advocacy should it still be delinked from needs and from our fundraising and the issue to get programs financed. Is there any way to delink this, if I got the question right from the chat? Sorry, is there any question to better link it, if I got the question right from the chat?
I was going to say, no, please do not delink it. Is there a better way to link it? I think that one other concern, I think, that links to the point that the fear that Jan mentioned before around being able to go to all these meetings is to also understand that as donors support international actors to be able to have advocacy people on their team and to be able to think through overheads and to be able to think about the capacity to be able to join these conversations, that there needs to be more resources. There needs to be more resources. I know that there are national networks, there are mixed networks and international networks that exist in countries. I think that there probably needs to be a bigger limitation, but at the same point, I think support for the diverse voices. And so considering the idea of supporting these structures as well as supporting the organizations, overhead is the #1 place, right? That's where a lot of international NGOs are able to hire some of these people and be able to have these dedicated resources. It's from overheads. So considering that local actors should receive similar overheads is, I think, very important.
Many thanks, Hibak. Jan, maybe starting with a question from Smruti Patel. If you set priorities and even only 2 for the Grand Bargain 2.0, of course the challenge is, well, what about durable solutions? What about shrinking needs? Is that something GB 2.0 should take on top?
Well, it was a great effort to go from 50, objectives to 2 priorities. Because of those 2 priorities, one is really 2 things: localization, more power and funding in the hands of local actors, which is important in itself, and the other one is participation revolution, which is very close to my heart. I mean, it's not about us, it's about them. I mean, they need to tell us how we're doing. They need to be able to criticize us, etc. And especially now, since protection, I mean, we're often failing in assistance, but as you said, assistance is now 1,000,000 times better than it was when I started 40 years back. Protection is in the area where we have made the least progress, if you like. I mean, ask the women of Afghanistan today, they don't just need a blanket and some food, they need protection. Or for that matter, the women of Eastern Congo or whatever. And there, to be communicating two-way is very important. So what I'm saying is that these are very broad, important objectives, even though they are 2 or 3. For example, the triple nexus is a huge thing. There are lots of other actors working on it, all for better, that the development and the humanitarian arm can communicate better, so that we stop being forever as emergency actors in places where there should have been livelihoods and should be development. One of the things I'll be discussing with my humanitarian counterparts is, of course, our concerns with the triple nexus, especially that humanitarian aid is politicized in the end. Like in the Sahel, we have to de-link it from the military and others. The reason that NRC is able to survive now with 1,600 Afghan local staff is that we were fierce in having nothing to do with NATO and nothing to do with the military forces and nothing to do with the military and political project. We were there for the people, and we can now continue. They know we're neutral, impartial, etc. So it's sort of a little bit beyond the Grand Bargain, but extremely important.
Final question on the issues which might be beyond the Grand Bargain, but at the same time at its heart. One of the questions has been, what about making politics increase funding, improve funding, and to look closer at localization issues? How, coming back to this big question, how to make political interests in the favor of these objectives and even the high political levels. When I talked to a representative from a big donor government after GB 2.0, and he said, oh, I really like this idea of Jan to get the highest political momentum again and the leaders engage, but it's not realistic. Our leaders don't understand what's the potential in engaging in this.
No, good. Here I need help. I mean, we have to do it together. But listen, there is not little interest. There is a lot of interest in the highest political offices to help Afghans survive in the next years. I mean, the West have their fingerprints all over what happened, and we cannot turn our back to the people of Afghanistan in this hour. So to bring it to them and say, here's international organizations, here's local organizations. You mentioned Akbar, Hibak, great coalition of local actors that we work hand in hand with. We need them and they need us now. So it's often also a question, I mean, it's not like the internationals have nothing to do in international work. I mean, ask people in Afghanistan today, we need now to be there and negotiate with the Taliban, as we are. We need them in Ethiopia to negotiate with the government, as we are, when local organizations are often very vulnerable in that kind of tumultuous situation when it's civil war and or whatever. So we have to complement each other and work together and strengthen each other with the help of our good donors.
As you aim to do this very task in Berlin in a few minutes and to run to these very politicians and decision makers in Berlin, the bad news is that we are running out of time. The good news is that instead of a final word, I would like to ask you to answer 3 quick questions with only 2-3 words, if you don't mind. But you can also skip and say, well, I have to think about this. Maybe to conclude, if you don't mind, and Hibak, maybe we can start with you, and if you can keep her unmuted, so it's not a back and forth. 3 quick questions. GB 2.0 will have been a success in 2023 if we see the following measurable result in 2 years' time. What would be the first thing coming to your mind?
More Global South signatories, so more engagement of diverse Global South signatories. The ability to track the commitment of the 25%. I think to me, and then the third would be the connection between the political caucuses and the action at the National Reference Group. Those 3 are very important.
Wow, I wasn't sure if you come up with 1, as you have been the first one on the spot, but she had 3 on her hand. 1 is fine, Jan.
We have succeeded if we pass the Kivu test or the Kandahar test. That we help people in their hour of greatest need, and we listen to them.
Okay. Susanne Fries-Gaier?
Efficiency is not an end in itself, so we have to reach the people. And if you want to measure it, then anticipatory action is good. So if we have more than 1% funding, we already have a good result.
Okay. Second question, we make it the other way around. Susanne Fries-Gaier, to make the GB a success, the #1 contribution of my institution will be to?
As I mentioned it again, anticipatory action, but as well looking in more innovative solutions and as well looking at more data risk sharing.
If we address it maybe to NRC to make it a bit easier for you to, or practice oriented?
Our #1 contribution would basically be to enable local action with local partners for people in great need. Yes.
Hibak, would you have 1 answer for that one?
Increase the local voices at the national and global level.
Mm-hmm. And final question only to Hibak and Susanne Fries-Gaier, because it's, if I had 1 wish, what the eminent person should do in the first place or tomorrow, what would that be?
That I'll have to think about.
Okay, we take the other 2 of the first question. That's okay. Okay, you prefer to skip that one. You had a good range of wishes, Susanne Fries-Gaier.
So I know that you are the person and you have such a big network and knowledge, and I'm really sure that you will push the process, and I hope that you will set up, as I said, a really smart, flexible and good process to reach that goal.
Okay, final wish and a final word by yourself.
Yeah, listen, there is quite a bit of expectations here. What we can do is bring some donors, some humanitarian actors, UN, international, local, together with the donors. Red Cross and Red Crescent, I mean, the Federation Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, for example, super important on the issue of localization we mentioned. To get these actors together in the room, I hope Germany will be in a couple of the caucuses, and then that they try to hammer out something that I can then push at the highest levels, and basically say it's now at the desk of the politicians. They can do it. More quality funding in the hands of people who work with local actors, but local people, and listen to them. It's we need mechanism for that, and I'm pretty sure we will find it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being with us. The final word, maybe also after we talked so much, might be also a quote from Jan after you've been appointed, that it's now time to act. Yeah, there it is. We need to make progress now, and I guess it's also the responsibility of everybody here, of my panelists, but of course also from us. We hope we could contribute something to get this going and to push it a bit today. Many thanks to the Embassy again for having us. It's been a great pleasure. Thanks to the teams of NRC, CHAR and the Embassy for making that possible. Many thanks for joining us so early after you've been appointed. Many thanks for joining us so early in the day, Hibak, and so early after being appointed for joining the facilitation group of the Grand Bargain. If you are on site, we would be really happy if you join us for a reception on the second floor. It's been a long time. We could eat and chat together. And if you are online, many thanks for joining us. Have a good day, a good afternoon, and a good night. Thank you.